Hello, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video. This is actually the end of my last video where I'm going to just dip into a bit of Australian analysis for you using the vehicle of the Ukraine the Latest podcast to help deliver the content. So anyway, without further ado, over to me earlier. Right, we're now going to go very quickly. I know I've done a lot of speaking today, but we're going to go very quickly to Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott in Australia. So somebody was talking about Australian support recently, and in my threads just this morning, actually, just looking over there, somebody saying that the Australian support is not as was expected, and it has lost its momentum. Tony Abbott was a plum tool, right? In my book, I used to write articles against him in 2016. Former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott's dubious speaking engagements, like his sexism, his like positions on, he was an absolute numbnut, in my opinion, right? Populist, right-wing guy, but Australian populist, different from Republican populist at the moment, and we'll talk about that in a second. Right. So I disagree with him when he was Prime Minister, but his position now is quite interesting because he's very pro-Ukraine, and we'll just get into that in a second. As a random aside here, apropos to nothing at all, Julia Gillard, who was Prime Minister actually before him, absolutely eviscerates him in what's regarded as one of the best political speeches, certainly in Australian history. Voted most unforgettable Australian TV moment, 15 minutes for her just absolutely verbally spanking him. And about misogyny. It's a truly great speech. So if you've got 15 minutes of time and you want to just listen to someone go, and Tony Abbott just gets smaller and smaller as the speech goes on. Anyway, it's gone from sort of let's have a look. So it was Kevin Rudd, then her, then Rudd again. He stabbed her in the back, didn't he? And then it went Tony Abbott, then Malcolm Turnbull, who I referred to the other day, who's really strong on Ukraine, Scott Morrison, who's real kind of, so you've gone from a right-wing kind of populist to more of a sensible right-winger to like almost a Trumpian populist again, climate change issues and stuff like that, to Anthony Albanese of the Labour Party. So Liberal Party is the kind of Conservative Party of Australia. Anyway, Tony Abbott was a pretty controversial ruler, kind of like Marmite or Vegemite, I guess, for Australia. You either liked him or hated him. But yeah, so now, though, it really is quite a different kettle of fish with where his positioning presently is. Tony Abbott, now not as Prime Minister, is positioning himself to be very much a pro-Ukraine advocate and is trying to convince Republicans in America of his position.
Sure, Dom. So Tony Abbott was Prime Minister between 2013 and 2015. We went through Prime Ministers pretty quick during this phase of history. And I was a political reporter in the Canberra Press Gallery, what you would call the lobby here in the UK at this time. So I know Tony pretty well. He is very much a right-wing warrior, conservative warrior, very controversial figure in Australia. And many would say he took Australian politics and certainly the Liberal Party in Australia to the conservative right.
Absolutely.
We park that because what happened during his tenure was that MH17 went down. And this was, I think, a very defining moment for his premiership. And when that plane went down, Australia was a temporary member on the UNSC. We used that position to go in and actually succeed in passing a resolution against that. We were able to obtain and negotiate access to the crash site. And this really scarred Australia because we lost 38 Australian citizens and residents, including a beautiful little family of kids in Perth. And it was really heartbreaking for the nation. And so Russia intruded into Australian life in a way you might not expect since 2014. And so actually the war in Ukraine resonates a lot more strongly than you might expect for a country like Australia, which is so far away. So Tony Abbott has always been very passionate in supporting Ukraine. He has always been a critic of Vladimir Putin. And in fact, in a very Tony Abbott way, he threatened very famously to shirt front Mr. Putin when he would meet him at the G20. And this is an AFL term. I don't really watch AFL, but it's a pretty biff game. And a shirt front, I understand, is a fairly aggressive way of knocking someone out. So he did make this threat to, kind of obviously he's not going to physically take on Putin, but that's the level of care and concern he had. He wanted to confront Vladimir Putin. Now, fast forward a little, and Tony Abbott is now out of office. He is one of many prime ministers in Australia that exists, but he has devoted a lot of his more recent time to try and appeal to the GOP, his right-wing brothers in the United States. And some of the arguments that I have heard on the grapevine that he's been making behind closed doors have been saying to the Americans, look, if you want this world order and if you want to face off on China, you need to accept the responsibilities that come with being the superpower. That doesn't mean being isolationist, and it certainly doesn't mean abandoning Kyiv. Now, I've heard to different degrees he's making those arguments depending on his audience, but we did see this stray into the public domain last year when he was at the Wall Street Journal's CEO Council, and he stood up and asked Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, and said, please don't let Christmas pass without approving new aid for Ukraine. Now, we all know how that's ended. The aid is still not passed. So I ran into Tony last week when I was in New Delhi at the Raisina Dialogue, and I said, hey, look, I hear you've been doing a lot of this work, and good on you for having a word with Mike Johnson, not that he listened to you. Would you do an interview? And he agreed, which is quite rare. He doesn't really give a lot of interviews these days. But I asked him what he made of the GOP and why, more importantly, he thought they would be on the precipice of potentially abandoning Ukraine. And without naming any names, he did go into this theory that he has that because...
This is the crux of it, right? Absolutely nails it.
Some conservatives in the United States think Putin is a bit of a political ally, and they think that because Putin purports to stand for Orthodox Christianity. He is against some of the things that, to use Tony Abbott's word, woke world is against, so particularly when that comes to LGBTQ issues. And so they've seen an association that's there. But Abbott was very strong with me. He said, look, no true conservative murders their political opponents. Speaking, of course, of Alexei Navalny. He says no political conservative invades and bullies their neighbours. No person acts the way Putin's been acting for 20-odd years now. And he said, one of the baffling things that I'm yet to understand is that on the left we've had this Trump derangement syndrome, but on the right we seem to have this Putin fascination syndrome. And I thought that...
That is so on point. So I think I've written an article on this. I've certainly referenced... No, I have. I've largely in one of my articles about how Orthodox Christianity so Russia or the Kremlin or Putin had got into bed with the Russian Orthodox Church to kind of work on making there a nationalist conformity with traditional values that allows him to control that population more, and those traditional values that anti-LGBT, anti-woke, all this kind of stuff, that actually resonates a lot with a lot of the American electorate. And so they look at what Putin is able to do as a dictator to basically pass these really punitive laws that outlaw homosexuality effectively. And there's a large contingent of American voters who look at that and go, oh, I wish we could do that. And this is exactly what Tony Abbott is talking about there, that Putin, well, as she says...
Right, we seem to have this Putin fascination syndrome. And I thought that was a really apt and accurate way of assessing it. And I also thought, Dom, that does go to show just how differently the right wings around the world, in the Western world particularly, are thinking about security, are thinking about the global order, and are thinking about what happens if America does abandon its post here.
So if he's...
I mean, this is really interesting stuff. There's so many sidebars you could have. I wanted to reference the articles I've written and other superb articles that look at the overlap between US conservatism and Orthodox Christian conservatism, or Christian evangelicalism, really, in America, and with the Russian nationalist, traditional values, Orthodox Christian approach to their politics, and why you get these people at Trump rallies who are singing the praises of Putin and seeing Zelensky and Ukraine as some kind of progressive moral degradation, which is exactly what Russian propaganda is stating as well. This is superbly important, and it's fascinating that of all people, Tony Abbott is able to express that as someone on the populist right. But as she says, there are different right wings around the world. So in the UK, the right wing broadly is dead against Putin and dead against Russia, and the right wing in Australia is dead against Putin and dead against Russia. And you go to America, and the right wing is bit of an issue there. But that's the variety of political position we have around the world.
Identified the problem there, Putin fascination syndrome. Did he have any answers or any sort of way ahead what we should look out for?
Well, I think from certainly an Australian perspective, and you see the Europeans making this argument too, it is understood that the Americans, particularly the GOP, care a lot about China and want to stop China becoming a superpower to topple or displace America from its role. Now, I asked Tony about that, and he said he also finds this argument completely unconvincing. This is the argument run that the United States must withdraw from the European front so that they can focus with greater attention all their resources on the Indo-Pacific and on China. But Abbott said to me, look, this same instinct, and he didn't identify it as such in the interview, but he is talking about isolationism, which is clearly rampant in the GOP. He said this is the same instinct that if they abandon Ukraine, will have them abandon Taiwan too. So he doesn't believe the credibility of that argument, that they're interested in preserving a world order or a security sense. It's just in a different domain. He thinks they're willing to give up altogether. And of course, he strongly disagrees with that.
I mean, that's fascinating.
I totally agree with that. I mean, quite what you do with that and what Tony Abbott can do, I don't know. But it is down to that idea, those links between certain elements of the GOP and support effectively, or sympathy for Putin and Russia against Ukraine. It's just so blows my mind. But also the argument that, well, actually we need to focus on Taiwan and China. Well, actually, this is how you focus on Taiwan and China, because if Ukraine win against Russia, China won't invade Taiwan. This is the best return on investment for that that theater, if you like, that you will get. So you invest now with Ukraine, and you will solve the China issue by nipping it in the bud. You take your foot off Ukraine to then try and focus on China explicitly. China's already been given permission to invade Ukraine because, look, hey, you're spineless over there. So, yeah, I totally agree with Tony Abbott, and I never thought I'd say that. It's a funny world where I am playing reference to Tony Abbott and singing Tony Abbott's praises when you should have heard me like 8-10 years ago slag off Tony Abbott, like because actually he is a prize plonker, like especially when it's some of the stuff that man has said just blows my mind. Anyway, I'm sure I have lots of Australians screaming at me who love Tony Abbott. Take care. Speak to you soon. It's been another long one. Toodle pips.